Israel claimed that Hamas murdered 1,400 civilians at a music festival and beheaded and put 44 or 50 babies in an oven. And then hey, welcome to Heliotropes. I'm Julia.
My name's Kwadjo.
And we are back by popular demand.
Yes.
Literally, a couple of you asked us to
Very
do
popular
this.
demand. The most popular demand. We appreciate y'all missing us and tuning in, all 5 of you. Holyoke Rose, shout out. Happy birthday to Mers, formerly of New York, back at Atlanta. You know what's up.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. And today we're talking about Palestine and Israel and genocide. We have a lot to talk about. A lot's happened since the last podcast, both in our personal lives and obviously in the world abroad. And we're going to talk about some of the recent stuff that's been going on as far as this more recent iteration of escalation, an iteration of Israeli violence against Palestinian folks. Anyway, go ahead, go.
As a lot of you probably know, today is day 39 of the U.S.-sponsored Israeli genocide of Palestinians, which, there's Hamas fired, Hamas on October 7th tore down, the wall.
2023.
Right, 2023. There was an incursion in which Israel came out and said that Hamas did some horrible things, which we now know a lot of those accusations to be false. And the civilian death toll of Israelis is significantly lower than what they stated. And since then, Israel has been, with the help of the U.S. and several other countries, has been absolutely bombarding Gaza, bombs, and now with ground forces as well. And supposedly there's also U.S. troops on the ground in Gaza as well. And maybe we should very briefly describe what Gaza is. You want to go for that?
Well, I want to start with my personal thing. And this is something that, it's a personal practice. Because even in, hearing that, so we don't, obviously this is unscripted, relatively unplanned outside of our conversations that we have. And even, in that coverage, in the synopsis you just gave, I'm a little unsettled by... really by some of the coverage. So here's one of the things about this issue in general, right? I think it's one of the most important things for people to know and understand when talking about this, when learning about it, especially when learning about it, is that it's such a high-profile, polarizing issue, right? And when you look at the facts of it, ostensibly in the macro context, it's very clear what's going on, right? We're talking about a genocide of a people by another people. We're talking about settler colonialism, that is the Jewish people moving into the territory of Palestine, sanctioned by European powers in 1948. To establish a state where a people and a territory already existed. And from that point forward, talking about, again, the European sanctioned genocide of the Palestinian people, in the sense that there was a recognition that and there was a recognition on behalf of the European powers who were sanctioning this. It was a recognition on behalf of the newly established Israeli state, who was, what's sanctioning when you're the one doing it, you know? That in order for this to happen, the expulsion, which, you know, culminates to genocide in the way it's happened, of the indigenous Palestinian people was going to be a necessary part of it. So, you know, again, in the macro context, that's what this comes down to, and that's really important to remember. That being said, there has been obviously violence on both sides. One, because in order to commit genocide, you need to do violence, right? Genocide is it's a macroscopic violent behavior. It's large scale violence. And in order to prevent yourself from being genocided, you need to do violence, right? And that's out of this kind of basic understanding of resistance, right? Resistance contains violence. And the question comes down to the nature of the violence. So that being said, you know, I understand that Julia understands all of that. But what I think is interesting in how I felt unsettled, and, you know, it's not like super unsettled, but I think it's, you know, that feeling itself is worth unpacking here, is in the way when we talk about certain things, right? Like, I think with this kind of issue, in this iteration, it's really important to have details, to have facts, and for us to maintain, you know, a position of not neutral arbiters, but nuanced reporters, and maybe not even us, right? Because I'm not saying, nor do I really expect you to have that position. For me, I think that's a really important position for me to hold, and it's a standard to which I want to hold myself when talking about this. So I like to be able to approach with facts and figures and say, this is what's actually going on. So even in, like, you know, explaining, which again, I agree with, I totally believe, but I don't know the numbers, right? That Israel came out and said this was the death toll, and now we know that to be lower, right? Mm-hmm. Or, you know, these were the accusations against Hamas, and now we know that a lot of that was made up. Again, I believe that intellectually. I know it. I can comprehend it because I understand how Israel works, right? I understand how Hamas works. I understand how geopolitics works. That being said, I don't know, right? I don't know exactly what the accusations were to say that a lot of them are false. I wouldn't even know which ones to say were false. And I don't know what the numbers were that were reported by Israel to say that now we know that that is false, right? And that's just to say that I think when it comes down to that, because I can imagine someone watching this and being like, oh, you're making an argument based on those things, right? And if we don't have the ground to defend those points, or rather, I wouldn't make those arguments because I don't have the information to defend those points, which becomes problematic in an issue where how we talk about it is just as important as the issue itself, understanding and acknowledging the issue itself, because there's so many other things to talk about and so many other ways to talk about these issues that are defensible, right? Morally, ethically, legally, any number of ways defensible to condemn the genocide, to condemn what the Israeli state is doing, to condemn the way, you know, Israeli jingoism and nationalism plays out, manifests in the culture, right, and is upheld by the people. So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay.
Yeah.
I appreciate your point in the way of, like, people needing information, and also that I assumed that this was common information for people to have, and that's a false assumption on my end. Israel claimed that Hamas murdered 1,400 civilians at a music festival and beheaded and put 44 or 50 babies in an oven. And then Joe Biden claimed that he saw pictures of beheaded babies, that pictures of Hamas beheading Israeli babies. And that turned out to be false. And 1,200 Israelis were killed in the Hamas attack. And now they're saying that about 2/3 of those people were not civilians, were military personnel. And so, like, as this keeps unfolding, every accusation that Israel has made against Hamas or the Palestinians, it has turned out has been an indictment in their own behavior.
Right. And I mean, something, because even, still, one of the questions that I think is worth interrogating here is, and it reminds me of a question that we received on a previous podcast and kind of addressed, but it's probably worth revisiting because it's a constant thing, is this question of how do you verify what is true, right? So when we say that, what Israel says at every step of the way turns out to be an indictment of their own behavior, or when we say that what they say turns out to be false, or, things like that, there's people on the other side who would say the opposite. They would say Hamas, all this propaganda. I mean, it's typified in Israeli propaganda, mocking victims of Israeli genocide of the Palestinian people, saying, oh, they're just making, it's a farce, it's theater, right? They're not actually bleeding, we're not actually bombing them, they're the ones who are bombing themselves, they're harming themselves. And, like, in spite of all of the contradictions in all of that media, right, like, are they not being harmed? Are they faking it? Are they bombing themselves? In which case they're actually being harmed. Like, what's the position? This conflict, right? And I say conflict in the sense that not just as far as what Israel is doing to Palestine and what Palestine is doing to Israel via what Israel is doing to Palestine and what Hamas is doing to Israel is not just, it's not worth only examining in the context of conflict, that conflict, right? Because we see how that conflict, localized, plays out globally and interpersonally and intrapersonally, right? So as small, and this is something that we'll talk about later, maybe in another podcast because I'm already going on way too long, but the understanding that as high profile as this conflict is in terms of genocide, I think Palestine, the population of Palestine at this point is like 1 million people, right? If that. And that's spread across Gaza, the West Bank, and, the territories, Golan Heights, former Golan Heights in Syria, like Lebanon. It's a relatively small population when we compare it to other populations who are being genocided, like, Congolese people in eastern Congo and southeastern Congo. What's going on in Sudan, right? In South Sudan, Darfur, that get a lot less attention, right? So this is a really politicized, really high profile conflict. And the gravity of the conflict, right? The way we explain the high profile nature of it can be explained in terms of, like, white settler colonialism, colonialist paradigms, right? But also, it's an opportunity to note that since it's not necessarily a question of numbers, right? I mean, so my point is, it's a microcosm, right? What's going on with Palestine, right? Specifically with Gaza, again, being abused, genocided by Israel, gives us the opportunity to examine how we fall along political lines, right? How we vet what is true in this day and age, when so much information is coming from social media, when trusted, sources of information such as mainstream media are increasingly politicized, right? And I don't think that's necessarily an exaggeration, although it might be like an asymptote. How do you what does increasing politicization look like, as you're approaching infinity, right? But it's still increasing. Sorry, go ahead. Just have a lot of thoughts.
Go ahead with what? I thought you were finishing your thought. That was the end of your thought?
For now. I don't remember exactly what I was saying.
Okay.
Or where I was going with that.
Well, you were talking about how it was a microcosm and that this is
right.
a time to test, like how we determine what sources are true, where our values are.
Right. And yeah, so like just keeping in mind, the conflict goes beyond what's happening on the ground, right? As with most conflicts, but especially with this one, since it's so high profile and it's so political, you would think that there's like millions of lives at stake immediately on the ground, right? But we know that's not the case. And again, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's involved in the campaign or campaigns to raise consciousness and awareness of what's going on with Congo, right? The DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. 6 to 10 million people estimated have been killed, right, in any number of conflicts in this region of the world, in Eastern Congo, in Southeastern Congo, since 1996, right? 6 to 10 million. That's 10 times more people have been killed, most of them children, than the entire population of Palestine right now, So again, it's not about the numbers, which means it's a lot about politics and who's involved and what narratives are involved and who's telling what stories. So when we think about this conflict, it's really important to understand what stories, what narratives we're telling, and how we're telling those stories and those narratives. Because, again, that's just as important as what's actually going on, right? Yeah.
And I understand what you're trying to say with the numbers piece and like the population. And also, there's Palestinians all over the world because they've been being displaced and pushed out for 75 plus years. And so, I mean, like, that also feels important to mention. And right now, at this point, with the current statistics, 1 in 200 Gazans have been murdered. And that is, people now are saying, like the UN now is saying that is a low number because there's people who are under rubble. There's people who are not accounted for. And also, while the genocide is happening in Gaza, the Israeli occupation force is also in the West Bank and has killed, I think, like dozens of people there during this genocide as well, and has destroyed olive trees and the land there as well, and pushed people out of their houses, Palestinians out of their houses, and is also bombing southern Lebanon.
Right. Yeah. So to your earlier question around, I mean, not question, but suggestion that we describe like the layout of the situation, it's worth looking at a map. 1947, really, if you look at, we talked about the two-state solution in the last podcast that we did, which for a long time was the solution, right? In diplomatic circles, when people came to the meeting table from 1967 up until relatively recently, anytime something happened, the two-state solution was thrown up. How do you feel about, someone's being interviewed? How do you feel about the two-state solution, as a thing? And there's a lot of feelings around that, right? But the idea is the two-state solution represented a hope for compromise, right? So when we talk about Gaza, when we talk about the West Bank, and again, we don't talk about the Golan Heights anymore, which is telling, those are references to Palestinian communities that were established, territories that were established as a product, right, of the, well, in a sense, as a like codified product, it was outlined legally in the proposal for a two-state solution by the UN, right? The Golan Heights was up in, it was like the upper, sorry, it's going to be reversed here, but if you know your east and west, Golan Heights is northwest, right? Between Lebanon and Israel and the ocean. The West Bank is actually in the east, bordering Jordan to the east, right? And Gaza was supposed to be more than a strip. it was the southernmost portion, right? So you have kind of
Right
like
along the coast.
right, along the Mediterranean coast, bordering Egypt. So you have, again, flip it. You have 6 quadrants from north to south, 2 side by side, of relatively equal land area for Israelis and Palestinians, right? Golan Heights, Israel, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Israel, right? When you look at the maps, and the reason it's important to look at maps is because it's one of the most clearly telling pieces of evidence for the genocide of Palestinian people, right? When we look at the success of the campaign, when we look for evidence of the existence of a campaign, right? Over the years, over the decades, maps really tell the story, right? And it's funny because actually one of the things I've been seeing is that, like Israelis today will show maps that portray Palestinian territory as it looked in like 1967, right? Which is 3 major blocks, right? And actually today you won't see the Golan Heights in there. You'll see the West Bank as a contiguous territory. That's like, it looks like a block. And then you'll see Gaza as a contiguous territory. However, especially over the past like 30 years, the territories that were allotted to, and these are territories of compromise, have been allotted to Palestine, have been territories that are increasingly, so when we talk about settlements, it's pretty much, imagine what the U.S. did to, indigenous territories here in the States, right? If you look at a map over time, you see gradually the legal territory of the United States expanding into the implicit indigenous territory of indigenous folks, right here, as the United States spans westward, right? And sometimes you'll even see pockets develop, right? Especially when we're talking about settlement of the Wild West. It would be, someone would go, maybe a few families, and they would start a city. So it'd be like a U.S. territory within, indigenous country, or, something like that, right? The same thing is happening essentially has been happening again over the past decades in Palestinian territory, specifically in West Bank and Gaza, is that if we talk about Gaza in particular, because it was really important that Gaza was bordering the Mediterranean, because that meant Palestine had access to the rest of the world, right? As you know, waterways are really important for trade, and the Mediterranean as a historical waterway has just been super important for access to any number of resources across North Africa and Southern Europe, right? The Gaza's access to the ocean has been strategically cut off by Israel for, I forget when it was, but I feel like it was within the past decade when it was actually officially cut off. That means access to food, access to water, and waterways. Anyway, there's a whole lot to get into, but the idea is these territories are smaller in their overall size, and Israeli settlements. So when we talk about settlements, it's really in the same way as like the Wild West. You take, Israeli people, you move them, and, again, this is one of those things that's worth reiterating. When we're talking about this genocide, it's not a religious situation, right? Israelis include, of course, Jewish people, right? Jewish people who have been in Palestine, because there are a minority of Jewish people who have been in Palestine for centuries. But it also includes American born and raised for generations Jewish people who decide to move to Israel. It includes American Christians who decide to move to Israel, because of this whole Christian Zionism movement. It includes Israeli Arabs, right? Arab folks who just live in Israel and, again, possibly have lived in Israel for centuries. It includes sellout Palestinians, people who, as we know, right, every population has them, sell out, right? And, that's not a statement without empathy. It's, again, a recognition of reality. That just because that's another thing that Israeli media will do, is say, look at this Palestinian model citizen who lives in Israel and is totally fine having second-class rights. They are cool with what we're doing to Palestine. So it's not a religious thing.
Like, the same is true in Gaza too, right? It's not just like
Arabs and Muslims.
Right.
Right. Christians, presumably Jewish folks, although again, not a majority. So settlements, right? Israel sponsors the invasion, and that's another thing to keep in mind too, is that like when we're talking about settlements, we're talking about flying in the face of international law, right? So when we talk about the situation being clear-cut legally, it's in the context of international law, right? Palestine is not recognized, has not been recognized as a state, but it has been recognized as a territory that it as its own territory, right? And yes, it's under the purview and jurisdiction of Israel, but it's also been outlined that Israel should not invade or encroach on that territory, right? So every time that happens, that's a violation of international law. And because of Israel's stature within international legal bodies, i.e. the UN, with the US at its back, there's been no recourse, right? When we talk about the international community and how the international community feels about what's going on, about what Israel is doing to Palestine, the sentiment is overwhelming. Israel's in the wrong. Israel needs to do something, needs to stop, right? But as long as the U.S. is cool with Israel not stopping, which, as our friend Joe Biden has, enthusiastically and emphatically declared that if Israel did not exist already, we would need to go out and create an Israel in the Middle East. Israel is going to be allowed to continue doing what it's doing and what it's been doing.
Yeah. So the settlements are illegal and they're violent. People like Zionists aren't just coming up and being like, hey, neighbor. They're literally kicking people out of their homes. They're murdering them to get their homes. Excuse me. And in Gaza, I also want to be clear about Gaza too. It is an enclosed area. These are folks who aren't able to, there's no free access, to leave and wander about. They don't have, the same rights that you have, leaving your neighborhood, leaving the city, traveling, or anything like that in terms of, identification, passports. Israel controls everything that goes in and out of Gaza. And so, in the current genocide that's happening, when Israel's talking about, oh, there's aid trucks going in, oh, what do you mean, there's not water or electricity or et cetera, they have been controlling everything for Gaza residents for decades and blockade things when they feel like it and don't allow people in and out. And that's something else that's been going on too. A lot of folks in the West Bank, or maybe some people in Gaza, were working in Israel, right? And then weren't allowed to leave. They were also being held captive. So Israel, and has been for decades, can hold Palestinians without any reason. A little bit here in the, what did they call it with the, they're war on terror, whatever the act was, yeah. Where you could just, arrest people who are suspicious, keep them, hold them. That's what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for decades, and, has people locked up, thousands of Palestinians locked up without any charges.
Palestine, specifically Gaza, but applies to the whole territory, has been described and recognized by observers, again, for decades as as the world's largest open air prison, right? for all of those reasons. When we talk about Palestine being recognized as a territory, but not as a state by international law, it's a territory, like Julia just described, that's under the supervision, essentially, of the state that's occupying that territory, right? And it's just it's a particular dynamic. And that, I think, explains part of the high-profile nature of it, is that even though I can make comparisons between what's going on in Israel and what's going on in Congo, what's going on in Palestine versus what's going on in Congo, the dynamics of this conflict are so particular, right? Like, I can't really, off the top of my head, think of anywhere else in the world where this specific settler-colonial dynamic continues to exist outside of Western Sahara, right? Which, again, is another thing. Look it up. Morocco versus Western Sahara. But even then, it is different. Do you have anything you want to...
You can keep going.
All right. So one thing that I do feel like is worth saying again, in the interest of nuance, right, is this whole situation with Hamas and like what role does Hamas play? I feel like this is really important to address because one of the things we know about capitalism, one of the things we know about imperialism, and one of the things we know in general about colonialism is that they're self-justifying motivations, right? That's not the best way to put it. But the capitalist colonialist imperative will implicitly create justifications for its own growth, right? And for its own escalation of the violence and tactics used to reach the ultimate goals, right? So we know one of the things when it comes to the establishment of the Israeli state from 1948 onward, the end goal, the ultimate goal of that project was to create an ethno-state of Israel where Palestine existed. Okay? If you disagree with that, put it in the comments. I would really love to know. If you disagree has been the end goal of the project.
Would be really curious for people to disagree since, the Israeli government officials have said as much over the past few weeks.
Right. And have been saying as much since the very beginning.
Right.
Because again, when it comes down to Ben Gurion and like the founders of the Israeli state, as well as the European powers in France and England who helped establish that state back in the 1940s, 1950s. This was their understanding of what was going on, right? And in the U.S., sorry, I said European powers and I left out the U.S. There was a very clear understanding that this was the project, right? And that what's happening today was part of, is the eggs necessary to make an omelet. Is the broken eggs necessary to make an omelet, right? You've got to genocide a few people in order to create a Jewish ethno-state in the Middle East.
Yeah, to create a stronghold in the Middle East for European and U.S.
right.
interests.
And, we can get into, semantics as far as, like, whether or not it's actually the end goal to create a Jewish ethno-state or to just create a secular Jewish ethno-state, right?
Zionist.
Right. But it comes down to, like, when you look at the way... Anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. But the strategy involves the creation of its own justification to grow and to escalate, right, is what I mean. When we, for example, look here in the U.S. at the war on terror or the war on drugs or any other war we fought, post-Vietnam, that's been high profile because we've been in a lot of conflicts, but they haven't been high profile. But the war on terror and the war on drugs are two of the biggest ones. And it's wild to think about. I think about this every so often, that in the 80s and 90s, there were suspicions that the government was involved in the war on drugs. like actually manufacturing the drugs and distributing the drugs, and like the government, the U.S. government was behind that, but the like existence of hard proof was few and far between. Whistleblowers were few and far between. Whereas fast forward to today, and it's taken for granted, right? It's easy to take for granted, but the abundance of evidence, whether it's circumstantial, like eyewitness evidence in participating in these operations, or documented, like declassified evidence, is so clear that the government was manufacturing and distributing these drugs, injecting these drugs into the inner cities to stimulate this problem that the government would then said we need to crack down on by increasing police presence and by investing more in arms manufacturing and militarizing our police forces more, and more intensely cracking down on black youth to control this issue, right? To control this problem that we've created, right? Going to find out, again, that these drug sales were going to fund arms sales that were connected in ways to Iran and to Nicaragua, right? And then the war on terror, right? Again, so the war on drugs, that was an example of the ways in which the entity the war on drugs itself was necessary to raise funds to it was necessary as a means to an end, right? It was necessary for the U.S. government, from the U.S. government's perspective, to inject drugs into the city in order to raise money to be able to engage in foreign wars elsewhere. Same with the war on terror, right? 9/11 happens, all the evidence suggests that who was at fault? Do you know who? Right? What country the evidence was pointing to? So a lot of people actually don't know this, right? But who would you guess?
Based on who we invaded?
Yeah. Based on the information that you have available to you.
Osama bin Laden.
Right.
That's what everyone thinks or says.
Yeah. Osama bin Laden
who was a buddy
Al-Qaeda
of the U.S. government.
Right. Like, this is another one of those things, is that, yeah, actually, right? And Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, right? Eventually we landed on them, recognizing that the Taliban was formed as a product of the U.S.'s intervention 20 years earlier, in Afghanistan, fighting against the Soviet Union to prevent the Soviet Union from taking over Afghanistan, right? So what do? We train and arm and educate folks in Afghanistan to, form militias to fight the Soviets. And then we leave, and then they create the Taliban because, we're over here doing what we're doing, right? Osama bin Laden was educated in U.S. universities, right? And then 9/11 happens, and we're looking for a justification. And even though the evidence actually pointed to Saudi Arabia, they say 19 or however many of the hijackers, the vast majority of them. And it's like, if it was 19 hijackers, 16 of them were from Saudi Arabia, right? It was something like that. Some ridiculous. There wasn't even a question of who was actually who to point the finger at. But what did we do? We pointed the finger way over there. And we said, we've got to invade Iraq, right? And you can look into it, and you should look into it geopolitically, all of the reasons that Saddam Hussein was in bed with the U.S., so to speak, to advance the United States' geopolitical aims in the Middle East. And then the moment where that fell apart, right? Because you can track it. And Arrested Development makes fun of this, right? It's that, because this was, again, during Arrested Development, it's one of my favorite shows. I think it's one of the funniest shows ever. But one of the things they do a really good job of is pointing out this contradiction between, Saddam Hussein meeting with high-end U.S. government officials on friendly terms, and then this complete flip of the script to where he became enemy number one, right? And the question, if you know anything about diplomacy, especially U.S. diplomacy, is why, right? What accounts for that flip? It wasn't 9/11, right? Because there was no evidence pointing to Iraq. There's no evidence actually sincerely pointing to possession of weapons of mass destruction, right? WMDs, which, if you remember, was the main justification for invading Iraq, right? All of this is, hey, blah, 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 because I could go on. But the point is, we looked for and created our own justification for going into whatever, right? And in the search for that justification, we created the justification to go in there and continue, right? Because being in Iraq further militarized, radicalized indigenous folks in Iraq who were tired of U.S. occupation, who were tired of being victims of this completely unnecessary militarized occupation by a foreign power, right? That's the nature of colonialism. You go into someone else's house, you say, hey, we're going to shoot things, we're defending you, we're doing that. But it's like, nah, things were cool in this house before you came in. Why are you actually here? And we just continue on with the same narrative, right? And eventually people get tired and they start fighting back, right? And they start learning how to fight back, and right? Fast forward, and then we have ISIS, which was the big news story of like the Obama era, right? As far as the enemy in the Middle East. That becomes a justification to go back in, right? Because remember, we got to fight ISIS. And a lot of what we're hearing about Hamas echoes what we were saying about ISIS 10 years ago. And a lot of what we were saying about ISIS 10 years ago, again, echoes a lot of what people were saying about Hamas 20 years before that, right? And the reason I say that is because when we're talking about Hamas, right, on the left, the common thing is, I don't need to condemn Hamas because Hamas is, and this again is talking about the narratives. What I'm talking about is the way the narratives that we hold play into this whole, our understandings of the situation, right? If I commit to the reactionary response to what Zionists are saying, right? Zionists are saying Hamas is terrorists, Hamas is terrible, Hamas is the entire Palestinian nation, and it's worth killing 10,000 Palestinian people in Gaza, which is the death toll, I think, since October 7th.
More than 11,000.
More than 11,000 since October 7th this year, right? And they'll say we've killed 60 Hamas operatives, right? 60 to 11,000, right? It's worth killing 11,000 Palestinian people, most of whom, again, are children, because a lot of the older folks have either been killed in conflict or have fled the country, right? Fled the territory, to kill 60 Hamas operatives, right? That's Israel's position, right? On how bad Hamas is and what Hamas is, right? And I think a lot of times on the left, or, the anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian position is to react to that by either not paying attention to Hamas or by painting Hamas with this paintbrush of liberators, right? Oh, Hamas is just trying to liberate Palestine, right? And whatever tactics they choose to use I'm cool with it, right? Which, again, I understand that position. But I don't necessarily agree with talking about it in that term, because what that does is it completely negates, right? It treats Hamas as a sincere agent. It recognizes Hamas as a sincere actor decoupled from the Zionist agenda, right? Because the reality is, when we look at the way Hamas operates and when we look at the formation of Hamas, right, we can understand clearly how the Zionist trend towards its ultimate goal of establishing this ethnostate depends on an actor like Hamas to justify its violent eradication of the Palestinian people, right? In which case, painting Hamas as a liberating force is just as insincere as painting Israel as a justified self-defending agent, right? Because Hamas then becomes a liability to the people, because Hamas's means towards achieving its own ends, which I think are pretty unequivocally the eradication of the Zionist state of the state of Israel, right? The complete reclamation of Palestinian lands with, no compromises. That's kind of like, that's Hamas's position. That's why Israel chose to put Hamas in power, right? Over more moderate agents such as Yasser Arafat's PLO, right? I'll leave it there for now.
I also think it's worth pointing out that Hamas doesn't exist in the West Bank.
Right.
And Palestinians are still being killed in the West Bank, right? There's the Palestinian Authority who is basically cozied up with Israel and who hasn't, made any moves to do anything to help the Palestinian people.
Right. Yeah.
How would you, one of these questions that a lot of Palestinians are being asked, who are being interviewed, and a lot of people are being asked by Zionists, and I'll leave it at Zionists. Well, I don't know. By Zionists and also by the media here is, do you condemn Hamas? Right? Which I think is a really enraging question. I can only imagine how enraging it is for Palestinians to be answering that question as their families are being murdered, right? Or as they're being displaced out of their homes, or they're watching, people they love and care about suffering and not being able to do much to help, right? So I imagine that is doubly enraging for them. And it also just feels like this tool of distraction, right? So what about what Hamas did on October 7th, right? And then you have Hillary Clinton out here saying, well, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. And we just know that's not true, right? Legally, or however you want to use that language, that may have been technically in place, but we know that Israelis murder Palestinians on a somewhat regular basis. I would even say on a regular basis, but I don't have all the numbers to back that up, and I know how you feel about that, right? But we know that, before October 7th, people in the Gaza Strip didn't just have all of their rights and then all of a sudden they were gone, right? That's not what happened at all. And so I'm curious, because I have now found that question to just be a complete distraction away from what's actually happening and the ongoing terror that Israel is causing, and the U.S.'s complete support and complicity in it, and a lot of other countries complete support and complicity in it as well, and to not actually address that or have other conversations around genocide and what genocide looks like, and why the mainstream media, why the reporter is asking me that instead of having a conversation about what's really happening. Why aren't Palestinians considered human enough to be talked about? And so I'm curious about your how you would talk about that in a nuanced way, because I agree talking about going either or on Hamas, oh, they're a liberating force, or oh, they're an oppressive force, probably isn't a terribly helpful conversation for most people to have. And there's also a lot of history around the creation of Hamas that we're not talking about, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that and how to talk about it in a nuanced way.
I think the thing about this, and anytime I'm talking about, because this is a thing that I've found myself saying a lot since this came up, not today, but since the Israel-Palestine, the Israeli genocide of Palestinian people has re-entered the popular conversation. I found myself coming back to this a lot, it's a question of how we talk about it. And I understand that your question is, how do we talk about it? To which I would come back to, it depends on our understanding of what people want to get out of the conversation, right? If you're listening to this, if you've been listening to this for the past 50 minutes, good on you, right? But if you've been listening to it, so here's the thing, right? If you came to the table, you clicked on this video and you were like, oh, I'm so enraged by the thumbnail or by the headline, right? We don't know what that's going to be yet, but it's going to be something outrageous. I'm going to listen to this. committed to not changing my position one way or another, right? Then nothing we say really matters unless we're masters of getting you to change your mind against your will, right? Or unless we're masters of saying something that clicked in the right way to make you be like, oh, wow, I didn't think of it that way. Now I'm open to change, which honestly is part of the goal, right? Because we're not saying we have the answers, right? We're just sharing our perspectives, hoping that our perspectives, sharing our perspectives, trusting that they're not just well-intended or well-intentioned, but that they're actually necessary to make the world a better place, right? And then we're also hoping that people, that the people who need to hear them, right? But in general, when we come to the table, right, this as a microcosm of what we want to happen, that needs to be the foundation, right, of the dialogue, right? Because again, I think when we're talking about polarizing issues like this, everyone's coming to the table, right? Again, recognizing that so many people don't know anything about the issue outside of what they've heard on social media and what they hear on the news, right? And understanding that there's so much, and again, not that it's so complicated that you need to get a PhD in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but there is a good bit of information to learn, right? It's helpful to go out and to learn about the conflict, right? Again, not in depth, really basic things. What has the UN's position been over the course of these decades, right? What do Israeli population or government officials say? What are they saying right now? You pointed out earlier, what is the Israeli government saying right now about what's going on in Palestine? Does that align with my values? What is the U.S. government saying? How is what the U.S. government saying? How's what Joe Biden is saying possibly biased towards Israel or against Palestine? Or biased towards Palestine and against Israel, right? Do that calculation, right? Yeah. But these are the things. It's how prepared are people when they come to the table to accept nuance,
Yeah.
And if we're talking with people who aren't ready to accept nuance, it's not really a conversation that's going to be worth having, because we're just going to leave that conversation upset. Everyone's going to leave that conversation upset and having not changed their mind. And then the last piece to that is, how ready are we to accept nuance in the conversation, right? Because if I'm expecting people to approach me openly enough to learn about the conflict, or at least learn about what I think, I also have to be ready to receive some piece of information that's going to make me be honestly, maybe Zionism is the answer. I don't feel that way, right? Because I don't think the evidence stacks up to suggest that genocide is the answer, right? Right? But if you come up with a compelling piece of, argument that can change my mind, right? I at least have to be open to listening to what you're saying and to understanding what it is and where you're coming from.
I think that if this is a polarizing issue for people, that's very troublesome. The way that you put that. And one of the ways I explained this to a friend, I don't know, a few days after this particular genocide started happening, was that the history of the land and the history of the ongoing relationship, it can feel complicated to understand. And also, certain people are invested in you feeling like it's too complicated to understand. Right. What is happening right now, the genocide, is not complicated. You can look at the Geneva Convention, you can look at the Holocaust, you can look at the genocide of the indigenous folks here, you can look at the Cambodian genocide, you can look at all of the genocides, and you can draw direct parallels and connections. It is so very clear about what's going on that is not complicated at all. And so the piece about like, if you feel like it's complicated, there's a reason there. And I wonder what that reason is. And I also, like, we haven't talked about race either, or the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, and like how mainstream media is doing that. And there is in this country, you know, this picture of what a terrorist looks like, and that person is brown and they're Arab, and mainstream media is using that hardcore, and they have been using that when they're talking about Hamas, when they're talking about Palestinians. The fact that any conversation, or maybe not any conversation, but a lot of conversations with Palestinians or people who are in support of Palestinian liberation has been started with the question of, do you condemn Hamas? You know, is indicative of the relationship that mainstream media, the West, Western imperialism has, and what their goal is in this situation, and what the message is that they want to share with you. And I've been thinking, trying to understand, and you know, like, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I agree with you, like, generally, in the way that to have some sort of meaningful conversation, there has to be openness on each side to want to understand where the other person is coming from. And, you know, like, I feel like there's a pretty hard line, at least for me, around genocide. Like, you cannot values talk, you know, me into thinking that genocide is a good idea. Like, I'm just never going to move on that. We could maybe have a conversation about, I don't know, Zionism versus like Judaism, although like I feel like I'm pretty clear on that too. There might be some things in there that we could have a conversation about, or perhaps like what happens after, or like how do you like navigate with this, or like I don't know. I'm sure maybe there's a couple things, I don't know for sure. But so like I agree in general around that. And this is not, like, I've been trying to figure out, you know, and I mean, I've talked to you a little bit about this and a couple other people. I've been trying to figure out, like, in my social media, there's some people posting about this on a regular basis. Some people posting about Palestinian liberation. There are some people who I know who have been, you know, like, talking about it for a long time, as long as I've known them. And then there's a lot of people who are going about their daily lives, who aren't posting about any of it, who are just, and who use social media regularly. So they're posting about other things in their daily lives. And a lot of those people are white. And I am disturbed and like baffled by it, because there are people I know who like are compassionate people who I know about what's going on. And so I've been like, was thinking about it, like why, like what is going on, you know, for them, that this isn't interrupting their life in like a meaningful way, where say like Ukraine was interrupting their life enough for them to be, you know, sharing information about it. But this isn't interrupting their life in that way. Right. Despite it being like all over social media and all over the news and wildly disturbing. And so then I was thinking, you know, about like mainstream media, like you've been talking about, and mainstream media as a tool for Western imperialism, and what those messages are that are being put out there, right? And like what you were talking about in terms of like creating the narrative and the justification around violence and around war, and how well media institutions who like historically people have looked at to be the truth, right? Like the New York Times, BBC, CNN, right? Like the left-leaning, you know, as they've been described, news outlets are starting conversations with, do you condemn Hamas? Right? And like, oh, well, Hamas is horrible and they're doing all these things. Or we need to support Israel because look at all this anti-Semitism. Or even this like pro-Israel rally that's happening today in DC, right? Or like, look at all these anti-Semitism hate crimes. Or if you support Palestinian liberation, you're anti-Semitic, right? This is all the shit that's on mainstream media. And like being able to, you know, like you talked about nuance, and I'm thinking about not accepting the premise of whatever the question is or whatever the narrative is, right? Like you talked about with the war on drugs and the war on terror. Everything that has come out after these, both of those, and these major incidents, all of the information that unfolds after that is damning to the US government, right? And like to mainstream media. It like pushes back against all these narratives. But that's the thing about propaganda. It is so effective in the moment and gets so much attention, and then the corrections around it don't get that attention, and people don't pay attention to that. And that's what's been happening here. That's what happened when Israel put out this information about, oh, Hamas murdered 1,400 civilians and baked babies in the oven. And now what, like last week they came out and said the Israeli government, it was 1,200 people, 2/3 of those people were military personnel, and like one baby died or something, or maybe no babies, I can't remember. And then they just put out something the other day after they went into a house and said they found a copy of Mein Kampf with the baby. Right? And then they like take that off their social media. And then they posted a video, supposedly of a Palestinian woman in Shifa Hospital, you know, saying like, oh, everything here is fine. And then guess what? That was determined it was an Israeli influencer. And so they pulled that off their social media. This is the government social media, right? So they're doing all of this harm and then pulling stuff off and not making any corrections. And so like, in terms of thinking about media, like the media is not there to inform you. Mainstream media's purpose is not to inform you. It is to get your consent and your support for whatever it is that the U.S. government feels like it wants to be doing. And right now, the U.S. government wants to be killing a bunch of Palestinians, because if they didn't, despite Joe Biden saying Israel's free to act on their own, if the U.S. government didn't support that, that wouldn't be happening. They wouldn't be spending $14 billion in arms to send to Israel. They might be spending that on your health care or food or whatever it might be here, but they're not. And so, like, I'm really desperately urging you to push back on the mainstream narrative and to question what where your news sources are coming from. And there are Palestinians, reporters, journalists on the ground in Palestine uploading stuff as they can. And you can get eyewitness accounts about what's going on. They are showing videos. They're writing articles. They're doing all of this to inform you so that you can have an actual understanding of what's going on instead of tuning into CNN or to the BBC, who have, what's the word? Alternative.
Ulterior motives?
Yes, ulterior motives. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got 3 things and I'm forgetting the third one. But to what you said, what was the last thing you just said?
The ulterior motives.
I'm urging you to...
Oh, push back on the narrative.
Right. So one of the things, right, because I think when people hear that, is that, like, you don't actually need to, like, push back on the narrative, right? In the sense that what you should be aiming to do is not necessarily put, right, you don't have to, how do I push back on this narrative, right? What you need to do is, spend time figuring out how this relates to you, right? And how the truth of this, how the reality of this situation manifests, how it congeals, coalesces in regards to your own values, right? And then you be consistent with your values on this issue, right? That's the key to, like, any sort of, activism, is that if you can't relate it to yourself and be yourself through this issue, sorry, not to say that, like, not pushing back, I'm not, like, pushing, I'm really just reframing, right? Because, yes, if you hear pushback against the mainstream narrative and you know exactly what to do, then do that, right? That's the thing to do. But if you hear that and you think, like, how does anyone, like, stand up to this giant of the mainstream media? How do you yourself, right, embody your position, your values on genocide, right? On colonialism, on like any of these things, right? It's the common refrain is
Interpersonal
that
violence.
interpersonal violence. When people talk about, oh, is that study? I don't know what study, it might have been a pseudo study, but that example of, X percent of people, a majority of people, would say that, believe that if they were, existed 300 years ago in the time of slavery, they would have been abolitionists, right? But if you really want to know where you stand, where you would have stood 300 years ago, look at where you're standing now, right? Look at what's happening now. Look at what you're talking about and how you're talking about what's going on now. Because the same shit is happening. The same shit. And the same people are doing the same things, right? And the real key to understanding that across time is understanding that yesterday's atrocities are today's news. That's it. Right? Like, what's happening today that we're looking at on the news and we're being like, wow, that's terrible. Oh, I wonder what side of the truth to stand on. Or, oh, I wonder what position to take. Or, oh, that doesn't apply to me, right? In hindsight, 20 years from now, we're going to be looking at that and being like, wow, well, I guess that's the question is, how are you going to feel about it? Because I think a lot of people are going to be like, I was on the right side of history. And it's like, oh, wow, the reality is you didn't do shit about it. You didn't do shit. But, right, so, like, when you project into the future, right, where are you going to wish you stood? What are you going to wish you knew, right? Take that into account now and live that now, right? So you don't have any regrets about that in the future. So you don't have any regrets about that when you're talking to your grandkids or to your kids or to their kids or whatever.
Your neighbors.
Right. And they'll be like, oh, you remember this thing? Or I did all this, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, what did you do? And anyway, so that's point one.
Can I say, like, also when I say push back, I mean, like, look, you can push back by any means necessary. I also mean, like,
by any means necessary.
Not accepting the premise, like, not just taking that in and being like, oh, CNN said this, like, this must be true. I mean, like, questioning that, like, who does this benefit? And we've talked about this before, right? Like, oh my God, these people were at a music festival. Why the fuck are you going to a music festival next to Gaza?
Right.
And, like, why the fuck are you there in the first place? You were born in the United States. Right. Like, some of those questions.
Which, I mean, that's a whole lot, right? So we've covered so much ground and there's still so much more to cover, right? Because, again, that's a question that we were entertaining, like, a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks
to Diallo Pinata.
of...
In part for me, yeah.
It's like, what does it mean to live next to Gaza as an Israeli? Right, citizen.
Born as a citizen too, right? Because if you are Jewish and born in the United States, you can be an Israeli citizen.
Right.
So, like, there's a lot of, oh, this Israeli American, oh, this Canadian Israeli. Just,
right.
Those are people born in Canada and the United States.
Right. And why would any of those people, like, I suspect that those aren't the people who end up living on these, like, frontier border towns, right? For any number of reasons. And then also remembering that as a capitalist ethnostate, or as an ethnostate, and especially as a capitalist ethnostate, Israel's still content with its own issues of class, right? So one of the things that can be really easy to forget in Israel's coverage of its own consciousness and identifying through media is that there are class issues, that there are people struggling, that there is an explicit underclass as well as an implicit underclass, right? There are people who are more fortunate, there are people who are less fortunate as far as, like, access to resources, codified or otherwise, access to money and financial means, and people who would be unfairly incentivized to live in places like the towns bordering Gaza, which aren't going to be the places where the money is in Israel, because that's not how Israel operates,
Yeah. And, I mean, there's also anti-Zionist Jews living in Israel as well, who the Zionist Israelis and their military force assault.
Right. The second point, which was my first point before the last thing you said. No, it's all right. Was, right, to this question of, like, people, or in this frustration, right? And this is something that I have to remind myself. I don't really have a prescription around this other than you have to be the message. all the people who are out there are just going about their lives. One, I get it in a sense. There's only so much activism one can do, right? Only so much organizing, only so much caring one can do, right? Because whether or not you're a person who believes we have a limited or unlimited capacity to care about other people, within this paradigm, we have limited attention to direct that care. So it makes sense that there are people who are great people, who are not callous, who are incredibly empathetic, who also just cannot find the time to engage with this issue. That being said, that's probably not most people, right? To which I remember that ignorance does not abolish itself, right? People who feel like they don't know enough to get engaged, people who genuinely don't care enough to get engaged, and thus don't know enough to get engaged, are not going to suddenly get themselves engaged. They have to be pushed into it, compelled into it, educated into it, right? Like, it's about shining a light, right? We care about this because someone somewhere, whether it was someone we know in person or someone we encountered online or whatever in our research, our studies, in a book, shined a light on our ignorance. And through that light, we were able to say, oh, that's something that I care about, right?
Yeah. And
so, yeah.
I guess, like, I didn't come back around to how I started, which was me starting with, like, really wondering, like, what kind of was going on for those folks. And, like, it is a curiosity for me. If it's, like, not feeling like they have enough information, which, again, is just so, like, that makes me, I mean, there's an individual frustration there, but there's also this, like, just infuriation, too, at, like, mainstream media making people feel helpless and powerless in those moments, and people taking that in. But, like, yeah, I mean, I am curious, is it, like you said, like, this lack of information, this lack of care, and then, like, for white folks, this, like, feeling like they're safe and it doesn't, like, their everyday life isn't impacted by it in the same way because their existence in this country is on par with Zionist Israelis in Israel.
Right.
For now.
Right. That being, you're the status quo, right? Like, society was structured explicitly for you.
Mm-hmm.
Which is funny to think about. It was explicitly structured, and post-civil rights movement, and we've talked about this, I've mentioned this in previous podcasts, that has become an implicit structuring. But, like, this country was literally explicitly built for white people, right? That's important to remember when we're making this comparison to how Zionists are living in Israel. Again, as far as the ethno-state Zionist agenda, Israel was built for Zionists, right? Whether or not you can become a citizen who doesn't. Anyway, there's so much. The third thing is this, and I'm forgetting it. The third thing was the second thing. But I don't remember if I said this before, but I like this way of saying it, right? When we're talking about how to talk about this conversation, who to have these conversations with, the important thing is, what are we talking for, right? Like, what is the goal, right? So when you mention, the question of, do you condemn Hamas, right? Because that can be a sincere question, right? But in the context of mainstream media, we understand that the goal is not to, I mean, like you said, right? The goal is not to have a sincere discussion about how the reality of Hamas's action supports or play into the ultimate goals of the Zionist agenda, right? It becomes a talking point to say, depending on your answer, you either already agree with what we're talking about and you're going to be a shill for whatever we're saying, or we're going to use this soundbite to condemn you endlessly, right? That's it.
Yeah. And there's no reciprocation either.
Right. And that's multiplied on, like, countless interpersonal levels and countless interpersonal scenarios, right? Whether it's on Twitter in the comments, on Instagram in the comments, on in-person conversations, right? We learn from media that this is how to have that conversation. Yes, if they don't condemn Hamas, then they're bad and they're not worth having it. Nothing they say after that is valid, right? It becomes a proof for validity instead of a means to understanding where you are and how you actually relate to this circumstance, versus having a conversation oriented around understanding what's going on, right? Like, do you condemn Hamas? I don't know. Tell me about like what you think is worth condemning. You know, like why should I condemn it? Do you condemn it? You know, and then like where does that go? Oh, what even is Hamas? Oh, how is Hamas created? Oh, like does this conflict transcend Hamas? Like was this conflict going on before Hamas existed? Oh, it was, right? You know,
Weird.
like yeah. So like what was the nature of the dynamic back then? You know, before Hamas existed. You know, like.
Yeah.
You know, what was Israel doing? Was the genocide continuing? Oh, the genocide was continuing. Oh, the genocide goes back to 1948 or sooner, before any of these agents that we've learned to condemn or that we've learned are bad existed. That is, you know, that's a
so
whole
strange.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think too. Like to your point, how you respond to questions, yes, and the questions you ask. I mean, my
Right.
gosh, if that's the first question you're asking a Palestinian person or somebody who's talking about a free Palestine, if you come at them with, well, do you condemn Hamas? As if that's the litmus test for your conversation, as opposed to, I don't know, literally anything else. I think that's also pretty indicative of where that person stands and what kind of conversation they're willing to engage in.
Right. Which, you know, I would reiterate, it's a matter of learning how to have these conversations and practicing having these conversations, right? And as part of practicing, it is practicing what questions to ask. And if you already know what questions to ask, right? Teaching people not what questions to ask, but how to ask questions, right? Which is really just the process of practicing how to get to the bottom of the truth, right?
Well, I think
of a
it's,
situation.
you know, I was reminded yesterday, it's a practice in curiosity too.
Right.
And like if you're entering a conversation in good faith and you want to understand the other person's perspective, it's a lot about listening and being curious. And those aren't skills that are taught.
And I wouldn't even necessarily qualify that, but pointing out that in this specific context, right? Because curiosity definitely has its place, but you know, again, given the limited time that's often devoted to these discussions and the limit, like even here, you know, like we're watching the clock, and the limited attention people have for these discussions. And speaking of watching the clock, I need to go soon. Recognizing that it's not just about being curious, right? Because when I say why are we having these conversations, what I mean is like really fundamentally, what do we want to solve? What do we want to address, right? Because again, when we talk about the complexity of the situation, you know, again, on an interpersonal local level, yeah, I would get why if you're Israeli and your children were kidnapped or your relative was kidnapped or someone was killed by, you know, Hezbollah or Hamas, you would be upset and you would take that personally and you would, you know, be primed to characterize all Palestinians in a certain way. I get that, right? And if you're coming at it from that angle, then the conversation you want to have might not necessarily be how do I end this? How do I, as an Israeli, participate in this genocide of Palestinian people, right? And it also might be, right? Because if you understand that there is a genocide and that what happened is a product of, like what happened to you personally is a product of this larger macroscopic picture, then that might be the question, the conversation you're ready to have, right? But that's just to say the way we receive things is going to be informed by what we're ready to address, right? If we're trying to, and we see this like on social media and in the conversations we've been having, right? If you come to the table wanting to address and solve the question of genocide, you're going to approach it in a certain way, right? And you're going to be willing to say certain things, ready to say certain things, right? The genocide of Palestinian people by Israelis. But if you're coming to the conversation trying to solve the question of kidnapping and returning people, right? You're going to approach that conversation in a certain way, right? And if you're coming at it from the question of like, Zionists deserve to have Israel because it was mandated in the Bible and in the Torah, then you're going to come at it from a certain, right? So really, like, whenever we're talking about this, right, this is one of my personal practices, is before I engage in depth in the conversation, explicitly asking the question of asking questions to ground the conversation around a goal, right? Are you really ready to hear and have a sincere discussion about what I have to say, right? It's an opportunity, because this is not something that happens. People just jump in with their ideas. They don't ever try to set the ground, right? Sincerely setting the ground by saying, are you ready to hear what I have to say? Are you ready to have a discussion about what I have to say? Are you ready to establish goals around our conversation, parameters, right? Are we going to be talking about genocide, or are you going to be talking about this local conflict that's happened, that started on October 7th, right? Because that's going to change the dynamics of the conversation, you know? So I would, yeah.
You said something in there that reminded me that, I mean, there's so many things we didn't talk about, including, you know, this other huge piece around the Holocaust and Never Again and Holocaust remembrance and how Zionists and Israel are using so many of the same like propaganda, the same dehumanizing, etc., to then commit this genocide against the Palestinians. So we didn't even get there. And then you mentioned local, and I thought you were going to say something about Cop City. So I'm just going to very briefly say something about that too. Like, we're seeing, and you know, this is something that had me like, as I was thinking about, you know, like why people aren't sharing information and like what it is about that too, also recognizing that like here in Atlanta, we have a direct connection to militarized police in Israel and the Stop Cop City movement. And we've talked about this before on here, so I'm not going to go into depth around it. But there is a ground swelling movement to stop Cop City. It is now to block Cop City from being built, which is a militarized police force that the city of Atlanta would like to build. The city of Atlanta police takes part in GILI, the Georgia-Israel Law Enforcement Exchange Program, where they, you know, exchange and train each other to become better murderers. And Atlanta goes over there to Israel, and then they come back here, and they become better killers, mostly of black and brown folks here in this country and here in Atlanta. And yesterday there was a nonviolent demonstration, march, at 10 in the morning. It started at like 8:30 in the morning, the gathering. There were requirements discussed within the, like, for the people participating, that it was a nonviolent direct action. And the police showed up and all of their military gear, blocked off the forest, showed up with their dogs in like little masks so that they wouldn't get tear gassed. And then they tear gassed the march, and the police spokesperson person said, "Oh well, some of the people were wearing gas masks, so then we had to tear gas them." So like I also recognize too that this comes down to in Atlanta, like on a really local level, and will also be going in other places on a really local level too. And so we also have this other, like, unfortunately very like clear connection.
And, sorry, I do have one more.
Yeah.
Because what you said reminded me of my fourth point.
Your fourth of 3 points.
Yeah, I had it, and it was I was merging it with the third point, and then I forgot what it was. But it was earlier when you mentioned the however many billion dollars that's been sent to Israel in aid just in the past month, right? And your last point about Cop City and how it's local for us, and how there's this literal exchange program that connects, right, the potential, the threat of violence locally / the actual enactment of violence locally, to the enactment of violence in Palestine by Israeli military forces, this question of connection and connectivity, right? Even if you don't live in Atlanta, if you care about whatever you care about politically, that the government says, your Congress people, your representatives say, we don't have the funds for it. We don't have the funds for universal health care. We don't have the funds for
school lunches, to fix
right,
potholes,
to improve public education, to pay teachers better, right? We don't have the funds for social welfare programs, any number of social safety nets that are really successful in Europe, right? Think about how often, and I'm just bringing this one up because it's such a big net, right? Like whoever you are, whoever you know can relate to this, right? They might be, as much as anyone might be like, that doesn't affect me. If I believe that the government should be responsible, take some sort of responsibility. Student loans, right? For my well-being as a citizen in this country, paying for roads, right? There's not a whole lot of people who, right, even the most diehard libertarians will be like, yeah, you know, we should have decent roads and the government should be on that, right? At least until a corporation can take care of that. We don't have the money to do that is directly contradicted by the fact that we are sending billions of dollars in aid every year to Israel for what, right? Like that has, like, Israel's ability to oppress Palestine, rather enhancing Israel's ability to oppress and eradicate Palestine, should not only not be a priority for the U.S. government, it should definitely not interfere with your government, the U.S. government's ability to provide for you, right? That's a direct connection, right? So, like, whether it's a specific local connection, like the one Julia just mentioned, or a much broader national and international connection, like this question of funding, right? U.S. funding going to Israel to support this genocide. We are all invested, right? We all have a stake, right? It's just like the Congo thing. Everyone has that chip in their phone, those chips in their phones, right? And computers and televisions and electric vehicles, right? We're all connected. So that should never be a reason that, it's consciousness and awareness of how you're connected and what you're willing to do about that connection.
And you're also so much closer to being on the receiving end of violence in those scenarios than you are to be an elected official of the U.S. government sending billions of dollars to Israel.
Right.
Right. And so, like, when you hear things that feel actually unbelievable in your head and you're thinking, how could that ever happen? Like, how could anybody ever do that? I would really encourage you to just consider, maybe just for the time being, that it's true. Because if you think back and you look back on history and like some of the things that you mentioned, those things have been true. And they're true now and they're happening.
So what are you going to do?
Yeah. Can you see us? Oh, yeah. Get involved in organizing. Find some grassroots organizing near you.
We'll put some links in the description.
I'm going to put some links in there, too, about journalists to follow in Gaza. And
see y'all next time.
See you next
Let us know
time.
if you want a part 2. Because we want to make it.
See you.